Wonder where would I be without you in my life? Everything was just a bore. All the things I did before. But you right there all my days. With the love you throw me away, I wanna stop. Thank you, baby. I wanna stop. Hey, thank you, baby. Hey, now I'll be if we love by you. Oh, tell me, baby. I'll be if we love by you.
All right, everyone. This is round 2 of the APUSH review session. Just real quick to check in. If you're watching, can you go ahead and type in if you can hear me? If you were able to hear the music. I've tried to get this as close as possible and get everything that's on the butcher paper onto the screen. I know it's not the perfect, but hopefully it's close enough where everybody can see it and can read it, and then that way we can move on and be a little bit more productive tonight than last night. So can everybody hear me? Do I need to adjust anything before we get started? All right, cool. All right, so I'm seeing that people are saying yes, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with this. So just a few points here. We're going to start off with period 8. I'm going to kind of wrap that up, and then we're going to go back to periods 1, 2, and 3. A couple notes here on my blog. I've put a Google Doc. You're more than welcome to ask questions, and I'll try to look at the chat window as after I finish up a period, and I'll answer any questions if I remember to do that, if we're feeling good on time. I've also put a Google Doc on the blog, so you're welcome to edit that. You can ask any questions there, and I can get back to you in a timely manner. I've also put on the Google blog, the blog. I've also put on the blog a link, and it has slides to different time periods, and they go a little bit more in depth. I'm going to try for as a reflection from last night. I'm just going to try to say, all right, so these are some of the highlights of what you need to know for each period, and then in the red down here, and then with the red underline. These are some examples of this thought or this concept. And that way I think we can go in a little bit more of a structured format. It's going to be a little bit easier for you guys to follow along with, and hopefully it'll go a little bit quicker. So starting off with period 8, why does period 8 start in 1945? Well, because this is the victory in World War II, and this is the rise of America as a global power. Why does it end, or what the significance of it ended in 1980? Well, this is the election of Ronald Reagan and the rise of the conservative revolution. So what are some things that you need to know, and where we picked up last time? Because period 8 is a pretty dense period in American history. Yesterday, to recap, we talked about the Cold War, the early parts of the Cold War under Truman and the Truman Doctrine. We looked at how it escalated in Europe. We looked at how it escalated and it got China involved. We looked at the Korean War. We looked at the involvement of the United States in Vietnam, starting with Eisenhower, then going with Kennedy, and then finally with the massive escalation of troops and the American presence with LBJ. We also talked about the Cold War at home with the Second Red Scare and the rise of McCarthyism. We looked at Eisenhower's foreign policy of brinkmanship, Eisenhower's foreign policy of with the Eisenhower Doctrine, which is just an extension of the Truman Doctrine into the Middle East. We looked at LBJ's foreign policy. Basically is consumed by Vietnam. And then with Nixon, we looked at Vietnamization, peace with honor, the expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos, and then the gradual withdrawal of troops after 1973. And then the last of the troops are actually going to be pulled out by 1975 under Ford. So just a couple things that I would recommend to you. We won't talk about Nixon's domestic policy with new federalism, his problems with inflation. We won't talk about, I don't have it on here, the problems with the oil embargo. I don't have Jimmy Carter's presidency on here, foreign or domestic. But I'm happy to talk about that a little bit if you want. And I think we're going to save Reagan for Wednesday and Thursday in class if you want to talk about that. Period 9 is only about 5% of the exam, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. All right, so picking up with period 8, we're picking up with the Civil Rights Movement. I said other minority groups are inspired by the success of the Civil Rights Movement and pressed for their own freedom and equality. Some examples of people that you need to remember: Cesar Chavez. He is a civil rights leader in the mid 60s to about 1970. He is going to be part of the United Farm Workers, and he helps organize Hispanics and farm workers in the Southwest and allows them to get collective bargaining rights. You see the Stonewall Riots. The Stonewall Riots happened in 1969 in New York. And this is actually the start of the gay rights movement. You'll start to see in the 1970s the removal of homosexuality as an illness. You'll see the Federal Civil Service lift its ban on homosexuality, as far as they weren't hiring people that were open homosexuals. And then we'll see that continue in 1993. Bill Clinton is going to reach a compromise with Congress and pass Don't Ask, Don't Tell, involving gays in the military. And then we see the repeal of that under Barack Obama. We also see the Native Americans get involved in this. We have the emergence of the American Indian Movement, or AIM. We see them come on the scene in 1969. They take over the abandoned prison of Alcatraz. We also see them take over a location in 1973 at Wounded Knee. And the significance of Wounded Knee is that's the last site of the last major Native American U.S. troops battle in 1890, and they took over a church there in 1973. With the women's rights movement, we see this really get its start with Betty Friedan in 1963 with the publication of her book, The Feminine Mystique. With women's rights, we see the National Organization for Women, or NOW, being formed. We see Gloria Steinem. She is going to be a women's rights leader. We see the Equal Pay Act passed in 1965, and we see the passing of the Equal Rights Amendment in both houses of Congress. However, the Equal Rights Amendment will never get ratified by the states, so that part fails. The Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, in part fails because of some resistance from American society. People like Phyllis Schlafly, they feared that the Equal Rights Amendment would undermine traditional values. It would undermine the American family. And I think the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment to get ratified also connects down to our last point here, the resurgence of conservatism that we see Richard Nixon lay the foundation for. with his Southern strategy, his appointments of Southern justices, and we see the culmination of that with the election of Reagan in 1980. The next point here of what you need to remember, liberalism under the Great Society continued to expand the power of the federal government. You remember the Great Society? This is under Lyndon B. Johnson. This is his domestic plan. Essentially, the Great Society would be an extension of the New Deal, or it's very similar to the New Deal. Lyndon Johnson is essentially trying to out Franklin Roosevelt. And we see an expansion of the power of the federal government. Some things that we can remember here under the Great Society. We have Medicare. This is a health insurance program for citizens over 65. It gives hospital insurance and low-cost medical insurance to almost every American 65 or older. Medicaid extends health insurance to welfare recipients. We see these poverty programs that are created. Lyndon Johnson, also as part of his Great Society program, declared a war on poverty. This has been in the news in the last couple of years because it's reaching 50 years since then. And so, what are some of the effects of this war on poverty? But some poverty programs that you can remember, we have Head Start. Head Start's going to allow low-income families early education access. We have programs like Job Corps. Job Corps is going to give special training to young Americans ages 16 to 21. We also see VISTA, VISTA. This is going to essentially encourage volunteers to help out in poor communities. We also see the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This is going to provide $1.3 billion to federal aid to help public schools purchase textbooks and new library materials. This is the first major federal aid package for education in the nation's history. Some other things here that we see that would expand the power of the federal government. We have the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which we talked about a little bit yesterday. This is going to ban discrimination in public accommodations. We have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This allows for federal supervision of local elections. And we have the Immigration Act of 1965. The Immigration Act of 1965 is going to stop those quotas that we saw in the 1920s. And we are going to start to see an increase after 1965. We'll see an increase in immigration coming in from Latin America, coming in from Asia, and we'll actually see a decrease in immigration coming from Canada and Europe, which is prior to 1965. Canada and Europe were the largest contributors of immigration groups to the United States. And then last but not least, we see all this, the Great Society, the Warren Court decisions, the hippie movement or the youth counterculture movement, all this social change, the civil rights movement, the rise in drug experimentation. This is all going to lead to a rise in conservatism or conservative politics. We see the start of this in 1964 with Barry Goldwater. Even though Barry Goldwater got trounced in the 1964 election by LBJ. He really inspires some conservative politicians, namely Ronald Reagan, and we'll start to see the resurgence of conservatism happening with Nixon being elected in 1968, and then once again we really see the culmination of this rise of conservatism with Ronald Reagan in 1980. So right now, before we go back to period one, I'm just going to check here and see if there were any questions. I don't see any questions popping up, so maybe they're in the Google Doc. If so, once again, I'll check that after the live stream. So going back. We're going to go all the way back to period one. Oops. Alright. Hopefully that's alright. Period one is going to cover 1491 to 1607. Alright. It takes about 5% of your exam. Remember that there's not going to be an essay question solely on period 1. You might see an essay question having you bridge the gap between period 1 and period 2, but you won't have anything solely on 1491 to 1607. So the beginning of this time period, 1491, we're looking at pre-Columbian America, pre-Columbian exchange, and Native American life without European explorers and colonizers running around. We end in 1607. What's important about this date? 1607 is the founding of Jamestown. This is the first permanent English settlement in the New World. So what are some things that we need to remember? One thing that you need to remember is Native American life pre and post-European contact. We talked about the importance of maize or corn, especially in the Southwest. The development and the cultivation of maize is going to turn the Native Americans, once again, particularly in the Southwest, you might want to associate the Pueblos with this. It's going to turn them from nomadic and hunt-and-gatherer people to establishing more permanent settlements. Along the Northeast and the Atlantic seaboard, we have the development and establishment of the Powhatan and the Iroquois. Once again, these are essentially two confederacies or loose alliances of various Native American tribes. The Powhatan are going to be located in the Virginia region, or the Chesapeake region, and then the Iroquois will be located up in New York. Then we see the European contact, and that's when we start to see, as a result of the Columbian exchange, horses, right? Guns, disease, namely smallpox, and with the Columbian exchange. Remember, the Columbian exchange develops post-Christopher Columbus, is named for Christopher Columbus or after him. And the Columbian exchange is the exchange of products and goods and diseases from the New World to the Old World, and vice versa. Some of the big things that we see coming from the New World to Europe, we'll see tobacco, we'll see gold, and the big things that we see coming from Europe to the New World, once again, disease. Disease is the #1 killer of Native Americans. And we also see horses and guns. Period 1, we also see the introduction of European colonization, and there's going to be 3 countries that we need to remember, and we want to look at the patterns of conquest and colonization. For Spain, Spain is going to be they have the earliest presence in the New World. They see the New World as a source of precious metal, right? Gold. They see the New World as a source of religious conversion. Remember, Spain is Catholic. Especially after 1517 and the Protestant Reformation, you see a competition between Catholic countries and Protestant countries for more converts and more control and influence. So Spain will see the New World as a source of religious conversion. Native Americans are going to be potential Christians, right? These are people to be converted to Christianity, namely Catholicism. And where they settle in, the Spanish are going to have a presence in the New World in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. With England, they come a little bit later. They see the New World as a source of precious metals. They also see the New World as a source for raw materials. They establish settler colonies. Once again, Jamestown, Massachusetts Bay. The English see the Native Americans as savages. We saw how and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we want to be able to differentiate how the Spanish interacted with the Native Americans compared to how the English interacted with the Native Americans, and the French, and how they interacted with the Native Americans. The English are going to mostly settle along the Atlantic seacoast at first. And then last but not least, we have France. France is going to see the New World as a source for raw materials. They're going to be really big into the fur trade. The French are going to see Native Americans as potential friends and trading partners. And the French are going to settle mostly in Canada and the Ohio Valley. As far as interactions go, you do need to remember how each of these European countries interact with the Native American people. Some examples of this: the encomienda system. The encomienda system was that system developed by the Spanish of forced labor. The Spanish were kind of seeing, developing their method in the New World after the feudal system. And so with encomiendas, we have land grants given to the Spanish, and you have control over that land and the people that are working on it. So we see a system of forced labor under the encomienda system of the Spanish to the Native Americans. Out of this encomienda system, we have mestizos. Mestizos are that mixed blend of races between the Spanish and then the people that were left over from the Aztecs. Once again, with the French, we really want to remember them as fur traders. A big thing that we need to remember, you saw this on one of your short answers, is interactions between Europe and the New World with the Columbian Exchange. You also want to remember Las Casas, Bartolome Las Casas versus Columbus. Las Casas, you saw in your summer assignment. He was a Spanish priest that witnessed and recorded the treatment of Native Americans by the Spanish. And he was the one that, in his writing, really protested against the use of the encomienda system and actually encouraged Europeans to switch over to using Africans as laborers. And then once again, disease. Disease is going to be a huge factor as far as the interactions go, or an effect of the interactions between Europe and the native peoples. And smallpox will be the bigger killer, or the biggest killer. Once again, period 1, 1491 to 1607, it's an era of conquest, and it's taken up about 5% of your exam. Let's see if we have any questions? Just real quick here before we go on, just some feedback here. Am I going too fast? How can you? Are you having a really hard time reading the board? Is this better than last night? Just some quick comments here, so I know before we go into period 2 and period 3 if I need to change or adapt. All right, so I'll give you a second for the delay, and just type that into the chat window if I need to make any adjustments. All right, Asleen, thanks a lot. Even though you're a Cowboys fan, I appreciate the comment and the compliment. All right, thanks a lot, McDonald. All right, so moving on, we got period 2. Period 2 is going to be about 10% of your exam. It covers the years 1607 to 1754. This is the era of colonial America, so the colonies, right? Period 2, just think about the colonies. The beginning, 1607, we've talked about this. This is the founding of Jamestown in Virginia. All right, so the first permanent English settlement. And then the end, 1754. This will be the start of the French and Indian War between England and France for control of the North America and the Ohio Valley. So 1607 to 1754. Colonial America, and taking up about 10% of your exam. So what are some things that we need to know? And once again, before I get too much into this, I just want to remind you that if you want more depth, you're feel free to go to my blog, and you can find the links to those timeline PowerPoints, and they will go a lot more in depth for each period. So number one, I think we need to remember successes and failures of European colonization. And what I have here, the first couple, I have some of the conflicts or examples of conflicts between Europeans and Native Americans. Number one, we have the Pueblo Revolt. This is also known as Pope's Rebellion. This happens in 1680. This is dealing with the Spanish, so we're looking at Southwest America. And this comes as a result of the Spanish, really pressing the Native Americans to convert to Christianity and repressing the traditional Native American religions. In 1680, the Pueblos revolt. They burned down every Catholic church and missionary in the area. They killed several Catholic priests, and they run the Spanish out. Eventually, a short time later, the Spanish will be able to take control back of the area. But it shows you some of the failures here of European colonization, as far as the pushing of a culture onto another group of people. King Philip's War. This is an example of conflict between the Native Americans and the English. This happens in 1675, so it goes to 1675 through 1676, and it occurs up in New England. So once again, this is kind of like the same story here with Native Americans and Europeans as far as conflicts go. Eventually, the New England Native Americans will be defeated in King Philip's War. Some of the effects of King Philip's War. This does slow down the western migration of New England Puritans, right? New England settlers. Remember that I think this is also a really good example of the interaction between the Native Americans and the English. The effect of this war is slowing down the westward migration here. Remember, the English, they don't live among the Native Americans. Their method of colonization was to create almost a sphere or a sphere of influence in North America, and then push the Native Americans out. And so this will temporarily slow down that pushing of the westward march of the English in New England. As far as the effect on New England Indians or Native Americans, their numbers are going to be decimated as a result of King Philip's War, and this is going to severely limit their influence and their ability to resist European expansion or English expansion on the years after. We see the slave trade. And the Middle Passage, so the Atlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage, we had a POA on this. So as we see the development of certain cash crops, and we see a movement away from using Native Americans as laborers, you see the development of the Atlantic slave trade. This is going to occur on the western coast of Africa. It will be started by the Portuguese, but we'll see the Portuguese, the Spanish, and most European countries are going to engage in this. The Middle Passage is part of the Triangle Trade Route. The Triangle Trade Route runs from Europe to Africa, all right, and from Europe to Africa, we see the selling and the exchange of manufactured goods, gold, luxury items, in exchange for human beings. The Middle Passage is the middle leg of the Triangle Trade Route. It's going from West Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to the West Indies or the Caribbean, and this is where we see the transportation of African slaves coming to America. And then from the Americas, the last leg of the Triangle Trade Route, we see the transportation of raw materials. We see sugar, tobacco. We also see molasses. This is going to be sold back to Europe. Some other things here, a little bit later into the period. We have the Stono Rebellion. The Stono Rebellion is a slave revolt that happens in South Carolina in the 1730s. As a result of the Stono Rebellion, we start to see stricter slave codes being enforced in South Carolina. We see the identity of the slaves continue its transition from human to property, and we'll see how many slaves can gather around with each other, the ability to read and write. Some of these laws and these slave codes will be passed, taking away those rights and those abilities. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion happens in 1676. It happens in Virginia. So what you see happen in Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, we still see the English in Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay area. We still see them using the indentured servant system. So we have people paying, or these landowners, right, paying for the transportation or the passage of an Englishman to the Americas, and in return for their payment of the voyage, the indentured servant is going to work for that landowner for a number of years. With the indentured servant system, the incentive here was something called the headright system. The headright system gave each landowner 50 extra acres for every indentured servant they paid to come over to the Americas. So what you start to see here in the Tidewater region of Virginia, you start to see a lot of the good fertile land being bought up by these plantation owners. And then another development here that's going to ultimately cause Bacon's Rebellion is that when the indentured servants' time of labor was up, they got something called freeman dues. So they got some necessary supplies to make it on their own, and they had the ability to buy land. However, thanks to the headright system, most of the land was already bought up in the east, so they had to push west. Well, who's living out here in the west? Native Americans. So we see these former indentured servants, or the lower classes, they're getting into armed conflicts with the Native Americans out west. They, being the Englishmen, right? They seek assistance from Jamestown, all right, and Governor Berkeley against the Native Americans. When Governor Berkeley and the House of Burgesses, which is the representative government in Virginia at the time, when they do not give the expected assistance to these Englishmen, Nathaniel Bacon and his followers actually turn against Jamestown, and they drive Governor Berkeley out. They burn down Jamestown. However, this rebellion is going to be short-lived. Bacon's going to end up dying, and as soon as Bacon dies, the rebellion is essentially over. Why is this significant? Well, if you look after Bacon's Rebellion, we see the rise of the use of slave labor by English colonies. And so this would be a turning point for the English colonies, especially the southern and the Chesapeake colonies. With the rise of cash crops like tobacco, we had indentured servants first. Then post Bacon's Rebellion, we have a shift to slave labor, and this will continue to rise and expand. All the way through, the 18th century, and then of course the 19th century with the southern colonies. Number two, how did England become the dominant colonial power? And then regional differences among English colonies. Well, England takes care of the Spanish in 1585, with, or 1585, 1588. I can't remember exactly right now, but they defeat the Spanish Armada. They also become the dominant colonial power by getting rid of the French with the French and Indian War, but will come a little bit later here in period 3. Some regional differences among the English colonies. So in New England, right, we have the development of the first Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then we'll also see that spread out to Rhode Island with Roger Williams, and Connecticut as well. So what are some characteristics among the New England colonies? Well, they're settled mostly by the Puritans. The Puritans come over to the Americas for religious reasons. They are going to bring, or be more likely to come to America with their families. We also see, because of geography, right, colder climates, right, shorter growing seasons, rocky soil. We see subsistence farming, or you have like little small individual farms, but their economy is going to rely on fishing, lumber, shipbuilding, trade, right? And so the economy is going to be a little different there. With New England, we also see the city upon a hill. This is the idea that was set up by John Winthrop. And the idea that the Puritans that came to Massachusetts, or the Massachusetts Bay, right, their way of life, their belief, right, in God, their devotion to living a clean and disciplined lifestyle, allows them to be a shining beacon of light and hope, to the rest of the world. So the city upon a hill, the Puritans, or Puritan New England, will be a beacon of hope, and set an example for everyone else to follow. Ronald Reagan will refer to the city upon a hill, in the 1980s. So, we can look at maybe a possible synthesis connection with a belief in the American identity, going from the 1600s to the 1900s. The middle colonies, we're looking at New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, right, Delaware. So the middle colonies, I think the biggest one that we could remember would be Pennsylvania and William Penn. With Pennsylvania and William Penn, we have what he calls the Holy Experiment. So the middle colonies are going to be a little bit more culturally diverse. You'll see a greater amount of religious toleration. You'll see better relationships between the colonists and the Native Americans. With the middle colonies, they're more of a merchant class, and you'll see New York City, Philadelphia. So this close access to rivers will allow a thriving commercial economy to develop. And then finally, we have the Chesapeake region. Chesapeake, we have Maryland and Virginia. The southern colonies, we have North Carolina, South Carolina, and later Georgia. But with Chesapeake, the Chesapeake region, we have tobacco is going to be the number one cash crop, indentured servants, and then slave labor. With the Chesapeake, we also see it's not very family oriented. We don't see an emphasis on education early on. And with the southern colonies, we see, once again, I think a similarity between the Chesapeake region and the southern colonies, cash crops, right, and the use of slavery. Last but not least, the effects of social movements, namely the Enlightenment and Great Awakening on colonial identity. Remember, anytime that it mentions this specifically, we're going to have to remember it. So the Enlightenment, this is John Locke and the idea of natural rights, life, liberty, and property. The idea that the government's job is to protect these rights, and if the government does not protect these rights, then it's the responsibility of the people to overthrow the government. You have Montesquieu with the separation of powers, the checks and balances, and then you have Rousseau, the idea of working for the common good. So the Great Awakening, this has happened in the 1730s, 1740s. This is I guess a religious resurgence, a religious revival. A couple important people here that we see. Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards had that sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." You might have read that or talked about that also in English 3. You might also hear the name George Whitefield or George Whitefield. He was another preacher, and a lot of these preachers were a good characteristic of the Great Awakening. It is the use of emotion to bring people to church and bring people back to religion. One of the effects of the Great Awakening, we see the rise of more religious denominations, and then it's a little bit more democratic than it used to be. So the Great Awakening also is going to help develop the sense of democracy within the colonial identity. So before we leave off with period 3 tonight, just real quick, making sure that I'm checking here. Which groups of the colonies would you say agreed with the ideas of the Enlightenment followers? All right, Jacob, that's a really good question. Jacob had the question, which groups of the colonies would you say agreed most with the ideas of the Enlightenment followers? I think if you're looking at who's going to take the most action, who will be the most politically active, really in the next period, New England, right? Where do we see the most political activity? Where do we see the resistance happening post French and Indian War? We see it in Massachusetts, right? So I would say New England would be number one. You do see some activity with in Philadelphia. Um, but I would say New England first, just because the reliance on or the tradition of town hall meetings, right? The tradition of a sense of limited democracy. The Enlightenment ideas are going to really appeal to New Englanders. On the South, because it was so rural. There wasn't ever an emphasis on town meetings. There wasn't that sense of community. And so you'll also see in the Revolutionary War, the British will change their tactics and go down south, hoping to seek more support or more loyalist support in the southern colonies. So I would definitely think the New England colonies would be where you'd want to say there's a connection between Enlightenment thought, all right, and action in the colonies. I hope that answers your question, Jacob. Let's see here if there's anything else. All right. So moving on, going on to the last period for tonight, at least. All right, period 3. The rise of democracy. All right, period 3 takes 1754. Remember 1754. This is the beginning. This is the French and Indian War, aka the 7 Years' War. This is when France and England fight over the control of North America or the North American continent. The Ohio Valley, so you maybe the rights to colonize the interior of the North American continent. And one thing to remember here, the colonists fought for the British, all right? So we have the colonists and the British versus the French and the Native Americans. 1800, the end. This is Thomas Jefferson elected as president. This is the first peaceful transition of political power from one party to the other. So those are the two important dates here that kind of bookmark or bookend this period. The period takes up about 12% of your exam. And so what are some things that we need to know? The first thing that we need to remember is the French and Indian War as a major turning point in U.S. history. Some examples here of the French and Indian War being a turning point. We see the end of salutary neglect. For a while now, the British had essentially allowed the colonies to hold their own colonial assemblies. Colonial governors would pretty much run the show, but because of the debt and because of the British need to protect their possessions after the French and Indian War, we see the end of salutary neglect, and we also see in turn the rise of taxation. And we'll talk about the rise of taxation a little bit more and some of the causes of the American Revolution. We also see the French and Indian War as a major turning point in U.S. history because post French and Indian War we see resistance to we go from a period of resistance to eventual revolution. So from about 1763 all the way to 1775. You might call it 1776 even, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. The Americans are going through and evolving in their position from resisting the British and this end of salutary neglect and these enforcements of royal taxes to actual revolution and a push for independence. So the second thing that we need to remember here, the causes and the consequences of the American Revolution. So I have the acts, right? We can look at the Proclamation of 1763. This is going to draw a line right on along the Appalachian Mountain Range, saying that the colonists are not allowed to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains or into the Ohio Valley. King George III says that this is for the colonists' own good. Pontiac's Rebellion had just happened, which was a Native American uprising in the Ohio Valley in western Pennsylvania, killing English settlers. So to try to decrease or diminish the chances of that happening again, the Proclamation of 1763 was passed. You have the Stamp Act. This is going to be the first direct tax solely for revenue by the British. This is when we have, no taxation without representation. The Stamp Act Congress. You see the Americans respond by non-importation agreements where they refuse to import British goods. You see the establishments of resistance groups like the Sons of Liberty. You see the Townshend Acts happened in 1767. This is going to be a tax on goods coming in or on imports. You'll see the Tea Act of 1773, and then as a response to the Tea Act, right, the Boston Tea Party, and then as a response to the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, which closes the port of Boston, puts Boston under martial law. All right, and I think that the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and then finally the Tea Acts, and the Intolerable Acts would be like the three major points or acts that you want to remember. Those were the three periods of time that we also looked at with our reading when we were looking at this time period. We want to look at some of the all right. So, cause of the American Revolution, definitely the Enlightenment, right? The influence that it had, the ideas of John Locke, Montesquieu, the influence that it had on the leaders of the time period: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry. These guys are all going to be heavily influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, the right of self-government, natural rights for all people, so on and so forth. So, a couple things here, advantages of each side. What are the advantages that the British had? Well, obviously a superior navy, an organized government, a superior military leadership. The advantages of the American colonists, they're fighting on their homeland. Motivation, they have to essentially fight a defensive war. Maybe essentially trying to outlast the British. And I think maybe a synthesis point here we can look at is like, all right, so there might be a connection between why the American colonists were able to win and why the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were able to eventually defeat the South Vietnam and American troops as well. Some turning points here are some key battles. I think you have the Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. This is the shot heard around the world, so this will be the first fighting. The Battle of Bunker Hill, 1775. This will actually be the bloodiest battle of the war. The colonists lose in Bunker Hill, but they inflict a heavy number of casualties on the British soldiers, and this gives them the confidence they might have a chance. The Battle of Saratoga in 1778. This victory by the colonists up in New York will convince the French to join the side of the Americans, and it was with French assistance that Americans will win the war. And then finally, the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. This is when you have Washington coming down from the north, Nathaniel Greene coming up from the south, the French Navy off the coast of Virginia, and in Yorktown, Virginia, Cornwallis is going to be surrounded on all sides and is going to be forced to surrender. As a result of these battles in the war, we have the Treaty of Paris in 1773. This will give the American colonies their independence, and we've already had developed by this time and ratified by the states the Articles of Confederation. And that leads me into my next point: compare and contrast the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Remember the Articles of Confederation, 1781 to 1789. So the Articles of Confederation, very weak central government. Most of the power belonged to the states. The Articles of Confederation only has one branch, the legislative branch. There's no executive branch, no judicial branch. The legislative branch cannot enforce taxes. So what are some of the successes of these Articles of Confederation? Well, a lot of really the sole power they have is dealing with the borders, all right, Native American foreign policy, Native American issues. And so two successes or achievements of the Articles of Confederation would be the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and the Land Ordinance of 1785. So the Land Ordinance of 1785 deals with the old Northwest Territories. So we're looking at Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, that area up there, and it's going to establish a system for the surveying and the selling of land out there in an orderly fashion. It also prohibits the extension of slavery north of the Ohio River. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, this will set up a system of requirements that territories have to meet before they can become states. This is pretty significant because it's a decision by the Congress that the United States will not have territories or colonies, but there will be an application or process for statehood, and these newly admitted states will have all the same rights and representation as the original states do. 1786, that's Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is going to be an important event because this is when farmers in Western Massachusetts they can't pay off their debts, they're losing their land, they're losing their homes, and they revolt. And this kind of shakes up and scares the establishment. So the next year they meet in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention with the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. But out of this Constitutional Convention comes a whole new framework of government. So some things with the Constitution, or the Constitutional Convention, and then the Constitution. So in the Constitutional Convention, we deal with representation. So with representation, we have the Great Compromise. This is a compromise between the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. It sets up representation in our Congress. So now we have the House of Representatives being based on population, and then the upper house of Congress, the Senate. Each state will have two senators, so equal representation. With population and slaves, we have the 3/5 compromise. So even though slaves are considered property, when counting population, each slave will count as 3/5 of a person. We have three branches of government under the Constitution, and then we have a system of checks and balances and separation of powers. So with the hope that no one branch of government can become tyrannical or overpower the others. So a couple of things here with the Constitution. We see the ratification process of the Constitution take place. And out of that has two groups. We have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists would be people for the ratification of the Constitution, for a stronger central government. And the Anti-Federalists are obviously people that want power belonging back to the states and a weaker central government. Why did we fight this Revolutionary War? So we can reinstate a strong central government. It seems kind of pointless, but the Federalists, with their campaign of issuing these series of essays known as the Federalist Papers. Convincing, namely New York, was their big push, convincing the states to ratify the Constitution. So when the Constitution is created, ratified, George Washington is going to be our first president, and in 1794 he has his first true test, I could say, domestically with the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion is similar to Shays' Rebellion. Similar, not completely the same. The Whiskey Rebellion happens in western Pennsylvania. It's a result of this excise tax on whiskey, part of Hamilton's economic plan. These farmers in western Pennsylvania refuse to pay the tax, and so Washington is left with a decision. Do you let these farmers not pay the tax? Do you let the states handle it, or do you show the power of the federal government and go in and take care of business yourself? Washington decides for the last option. He's going to send the military into Pennsylvania to put down this rebellion. So this will be the first time the federal government sends troops into a state. and it's meant to enforce the tax and show the supremacy of the federal government. The last thing we need to know is like political parties. Political parties are forming as a result of this. I think one of the reasons why it forms is due to the ratification of the Constitution, that process. But then during Washington's administration, we see the first political parties formed. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are more like factions. So political parties formed during Washington's administration. We have the Federalists with Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans with Jefferson. The stances are going to be very similar to those held by the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Hamilton's economic plan will be a big one. Hamilton's a Secretary of the Treasury. His job is to get the economy up and running. So he comes up with a plan. First part of his plan, assumption. The federal government will assume states' debts from the Revolutionary War. Hamilton believes that if the people that bought bonds in the Revolutionary War, if the federal government was in debt to them, then they would be loyal to the federal government, and they would want to see the federal government succeed. If the states still owed them money, well, they would be more interested in seeing the state governments being successful. So Hamilton transfers the balance of debt from the states to the federal government and hopes to see more of an incentive from wealthy people to see this government out. To get the Democratic Republicans and Jefferson to agree to this, Hamilton and the Federalists agreed to move Washington, D.C. From New York at the time, move the capital, from New York to Washington, D.C. The thinking behind it is that if it's in the South, then the federal government would be a little bit more responsive to Southern needs and interests. The other parts of Hamilton's economic plan would be tariffs, so taxes on imported goods to help out with American manufacturing. This is opposed by Jefferson because Jefferson has an idea or a vision of the country being built based on agriculture. So an agrarian economy versus an industrial economy. The industrial economy is going to win out, not only with Hamilton's economic plan, but just in the grand scheme of things, we become an industrial country. We also see the whiskey tax, right? Then this is a chance to earn revenue, to earn money. And the last part of Hamilton's economic plan, and one of the most controversial parts, would be the creation of the Bank of the United States. And this is where the interpretation of the Constitution is being debated. Hamilton and the Federalists have a loose interpretation of the Constitution, so they would be in favor of the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. You don't have to read word for word that the federal government has this power in the Constitution for the federal government to be able to do it. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans have a strict interpretation of the Constitution. You have to be able to see, you have to be able to find in the Constitution that the federal government has this power, or else it's not allowed to do it. Washington is going to be key here. Washington sides with Hamilton on a number of these issues. That's why his economic plan gets passed. We see the French Revolution occurring during Washington's administration. This is going to help lead to the development of political parties. Hamilton and the Federalists will be more likely to side with the British. And then Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans are more sympathetic to the French. And the French Revolution, I should mention, the French Revolution is seen as an extension of the American Revolution as far as ideology goes, but the French Revolution eventually escalates and brings in Great Britain as well, and so that's where those two sides were formed. And then last but not least, the farewell address by George Washington. George Washington, he has established this precedent of establishing a cabinet and also leaving after 2 4-year terms. He didn't have to do that. Nowhere in the Constitution did it say he had to do that, but he decides to leave after 2 4-year terms. And in this farewell address, he warns about the formation of political parties. He says it's going to lead to sectionalism, which it does. He warns about permanent foreign alliances. We feel like we don't want to get involved, and we don't need to get involved in the affairs of Europe. That will lead to the Monroe Doctrine. And then he says that good government's based on religion and morality. So once again, making sure that you have a good moral compass if you're going to go into government. And then I do have one thing here talking about foreign policy, and I think that can continue on to period 4. Foreign policy, really the trouble that the Americans see, starting with Washington's administration, is impressment. We see impressment with Washington, and he tries to deal with it with Jay's Treaty. We see impressment with John Adams, the second president, and with the XYZ affair, and he tries to deal with it with the Alien Sedition Acts, which will lead to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And then we'll see it have to be dealt with Jefferson, and the letter of James Madison culminating in the War of 1812. Well, guys, that's all I have. I hope that it was a little bit more helpful to you guys, and that you agree that you liked it. All right, Bailey, I'm reading your question right now. Do you have any idea what period will likely be asked about for an essay, or I'm guessing you're saying your long essay question? Is there a good chance it will be on this period? I would have to look back through the past exams. Typically, the College Board likes to do a rotation of time periods as far as essays or essay prompts that they're asking. Right off the top of my head, I can't remember what last year or the last couple years were about. I can have that answer for you on tomorrow, though. I think you can, depending on you know what time period they were asking the DBQ on, and what time period they were asking the long essay question on from the last couple of years, you might be able to gamble and say, well, they're not going to do this, and they're not going to ask about that for the essay prompt. But anytime you gamble, right, you're taking a risk. So I don't know right now, but I'll get that answer to you in class on tomorrow, or I'll try to put it on the Google Doc. But I think I'll probably look that up tonight and give you that answer in class. Let's see, what else do we got? Anything else? Anything else? Evan says, okay, I'm here. Well, Evan, you're late to the party. Let's see. Guys, I hope once again, thank you so much for spending your time with me for this last hour. I thought this went a lot smoother. I think that it was a little bit more helpful for you guys, and I hope we can do it again tomorrow. All right. Without any other if there's nothing else, I will see you tomorrow. I'm going to end the stream. All right. Thanks a lot.